My name is Adam Blackwell. I'm the Vice President, International Development Services Group, and on behalf of the team at the Global Terrorism Trends and Analysis Center, or GTTAC, I'll be moderating this session. This is a continuation of a series of talks by eminent people in the field of terrorism. The views expressed here are those of the presenter. Professor Kumar Ramakrishna is Professor of National Security Studies, the Provost Chair in National Security Studies, the Dean of the Rajaratnam School of International Studies, RSIS, as well as a research advisor to the International Center for Political Violence and Terrorism Research at RSIS. Prior to current appointments, he was the head of International Center for Political Violence and Terrorism Research, the head of the Center of Excellence for National Security, and the head of National Security Studies Program. He is also Associate Dean for Policy Studies. A historian by background, Professor has been a frequent speaker on counterterrorism before local and international audiences, a regular media commentator on counterterrorism, an established author in numerous internationally referenced journals, the author of many books, and in the respected journal Perspectives on Terrorism, which identified Professor Ramakrishna as one of the Southeast Asia's leading terrorism experts. His recent research has focused on understanding, preventing, and countering violent extremism in Southeast Asia. Professor will speak for approximately 20 minutes on extremist Islam, recognition and response in Southeast Asia. We'll then have about 20 minutes for dialogue. Please use the Q&A function in Zoom. And Professor, over to you.
Thanks, Ambassador Blackwell, and good morning to all of you. In the US, it's evening here in Singapore. As Ambassador Blackwell has pointed out, I'll be speaking on this particular topic, online extremism and identifying what I call Salafists in Southeast Asia. So, as Ambassador Blackwell mentioned briefly, last year I came out with a book on extremist Islam, recognition and response in Southeast Asia. So my talk essentially draws upon this particular work. So as far as Southeast Asia is concerned, just to sketch the evolving threat picture, the transnational terrorist threat situation in Southeast Asia has evolved in the past 20 years or so since the September 11 attacks and the discovery of the Al-Qaeda-linked Jamaat Islamiyah or JI cells in the Southeast Asian region. The threat back then, 20 years ago, was essentially from organized terrorist networks like Al-Qaeda and JI that were at the outset relatively hierarchically organized, certainly in Southeast Asia in terms of JI. But since over the past decade or so, the threat has evolved. There are still organized network type threats like ISIS and Jamaah Ansarud Daulah or JAD in Indonesia, MIT, which is the East Indonesian Mujahideen, the Abu Sayyaf group in Philippines. And thanks to internet and social media, the extremist ideology has evolved and spread through cyberspace. So you have certainly seen, just like other parts of the world, the rise of lone wolf attacks and certainly self-radicalization cases. In fact, last year, there was a major report by the Singapore Ministry of Home Affairs which pointed to the pro-ISIS ecosystem on social media as a concern. So my talk today will examine the evolving online transnational Islamist terror threat in Southeast Asia at this point in time, but also other elements of the Islamist extremism, or what I prefer to call the Salafist ecosystem in the region. So very quickly, a broad kind of like a overview of the current violent extremism landscape in our region. I have to say that I think there's been a sense of a decreasing threat, kinetically speaking, due to the continuation of effective counterterrorism operations in key countries. Certainly, we have seen leadership decapitations and retaking of terrorist safe havens, certainly in southern Philippines. There's been a lot of progress there. But we still have seen a few plots and attacks reported in the region, right? Of course, the pandemic restrictions affected not just the general population, but also reduced the opportunity for the militants themselves to carry out their operations. It also reduced crowds in public spaces which provided targets for attack. But the militants, of course, didn't stand still. They talked about increasing lone wolf attacks. There were a few such attacks. But what we have seen as well is a growing involvement of women, youth, and family networks in operational roles, not just support roles, but operational roles such as suicide bombers in the region. And of course, like many other parts of the world, during the lockdowns, the restrictions of movement due to the lockdowns because of the pandemic, people spend more time online, and this raised the likelihood of vulnerable individuals being radicalized, right? So I mentioned at the outset that to me, the threat of Islamist extremist ideology, we need to unpack this a bit. What do we really mean by it? As we all know, there have been different terms that have been used: radical Islam, radical Islamism, Wahhabism, etc. Even Salafism. But Salafi, right, the term Salafi is too broad. And I would say in Southeast Asia, certainly a very sensitive term. And anyway, which Salafis are you talking about? Are you talking about the modernist Salafis, the purist Salafis? So my argument is that we should, analytically speaking, drill it down a bit more. So the real challenge, in my view, is what I would call Salafabist extremism. I didn't invent the term Salafism. Salafabism. It's been invented by other scholars like Khalid Abu El-Fadil from the US, the late Professor Riaz Hassan, and Philip Holtman, a German scholar. So in a nutshell, Salafabist extremism is essentially Wahhabized purist Salafism, right? And this is a quotation by Khalid Abu Al-Fadil, what Salafabism is. So it is a supremacist Puritanism that compensates for feelings of defeatism, disempowerment, alienation, right? I mean, as you can see, it's a very, essentially believers versus non-believers, right? It's a very rigid way of thinking, or a theology which is very rigid. According to this model, there are only two paths in life: path of God and the path of the evil one, right? And according to this interpretation, the Salafabist interpretation, Islam is the only straight path in life and must be pursued at all costs, right? Regardless of how it impacts other people's rights and well-being. Now, Salafabist extremism essentially is manifested in two modes. What I would call which is very familiar to us, the violent, hard Salafi jihadist mode. And these are essentially the violent guys, right? ISIS or Al-Qaeda in Southeast Asia, Jamaat Islamiyah or JAD. But also the more subtle, harder to detect, what I would call the not violent, soft Salafabist Islamist mode. So yeah, just keep this in mind. Two modes of Salafabist extremism: the violent, hard Salafabist Salafi jihadis, right? And the not violent, soft Salafabist Islamists, right? So why not violent? Why do I say not violent instead of non-violent? There's been a lot of literature, actually, academic literature, talking about these ideas. For example, the scholar Alex Schmidt has argued that some ideas carry within them the seeds of at best intolerance and at worst violence. So-called non-violent extremists have actually been found to be ideologically closer to jihadist organizations than the moderate Muslim majority. So that's why I don't think there's such a thing as a non-violent extremist, although the term is widely used. I would use the term not violent extremist. Another scholar, Jacob Olidot, shares a similar idea. He says, because of a shared theological DNA, it's not that hard to move from a quietist to jihadist, because essentially it's the same ideology, right? It's the same ideology. Thomas Heckhammer similarly says that there are sociological and discursive links between militant Islamists and so-called non-violent actors sharing the same dominant rationale. So what's the point? Soft Salafabist Islamists have a shared theological DNA with the hard Salafabist Salafi jihadis we all tend to focus on. Both groups, the soft Salafabist Islamists as well as the violent hard Salafabist Salafi jihadis, they are both the same in the sense that they are Salafist extremists. It's just that operating in different modes. One in the soft mode, not violent mode, and the other in the hard violent mode. So to me, soft Salafist Islamists who are harder to detect, especially online, they are more accurately understood as not violent rather than genuinely non-violent. So that, and my view is that the soft Salafist Islamists are arguably of policy concern too. We also need to distinguish, as I argue in my book, we have to distinguish between the Salafist radicals and the Salafist extremists. A radical is not an extremist. A radical is relatively open-minded. You can debate, negotiate with him. You can perhaps come to some common understanding. It is the extremist who is close-minded and impervious to alternative viewpoints. So to me, hard law enforcement measures should be used to deal with the extremists, both the soft Salafist Islamists, as I mentioned, and the hard Salafi jihadis, because, as mentioned, these two groups, categories, share a common theological DNA, right? But the radicals are different because these are the guys we governments and civil society could potentially work with. Because these guys, they may be Salafists in their orientation, their thinking, but they are able to work within, genuinely willing to work within secular, multicultural political systems peacefully and constitutionally. So the policy challenge is to differentiate the extremists from the radicals, and indeed the moderate Muslims, right, within the Islamist political parties and civil society spaces in Southeast Asia. So the question then becomes, how do we identify religious extremists in general that can help differentiate them from the religious radicals, right? So I talk about 7 key characteristics of religious extremists, which also applies to Salafist extremists, right? The first characteristic of religious extremists is identity supremacy. They believe that their particular religious belief system should be on top, above universally recognized international customs, as well as mainstream national, constitutional, ideological, and theological currents. So identity supremacy. Number 2, second characteristic, in-group bias. My group has a good essence, right? And therefore, my in-group is morally superior to the out-group. Third, my in-group is not only morally superior and has a good essence, the out-group has a natural bad essence. So there's identity supremacy, there's in-group bias, and 3, out-group prejudice. The fourth characteristic, right? This obsession with purity, right? The extremist does not want his in-group's good essence to be contaminated, so to speak, through too close commingling with members of the out-group. So this is expressed on the ground through, for example, an emphasis on social segregationism, social distancing, discrimination in various ways, certainly no intermarriage, no patronizing of the out-group members' businesses, for example. A fifth characteristic, low integrated complexity, which essentially means a very black and white view of the world, very simplified black and white view of the world. 6, a tendency to engage in dangerous speech towards out-group members. So I've talked about, written about how dangerous speech can be expressed in 2 modes. In the hard mode, this is direct incitement to out-group violence. For example, the guy may say, go out and kill members of the out-group. But sometimes online, you don't see that so direct, right? You see more indirect incitement, right? Through linguistic dehumanization, through innuendo, which tends to promote, rather than outright violence, intolerance, right? So that's what I call the soft mode of dangerous speech. And the 7th and final characteristic of the religious extremists, right, which also applies to the Salafist extremists, is the quest through any means possible, including potentially violence, the political power to restructure the wider polity in society in line with the Salafist or whatever religious vision, right, and which tends to marginalize relevant outgroups, right? So these 7 key characteristics of religious extremists in general and Salafist extremists in particular highlight two further key points of note. Religious extremism in general, including Salafist extremism, is what I would call an acute form of religious fundamentalism. That's number one. Number two, and it's important, violence, right, is not just expressed in terms of physical harm. It can also be built into the socio-political structure. It can be structural, right? So some scholars say that, well, we shouldn't really take the extremism bit that seriously because the religious extremism is a mere rhetorical device to mask what are essentially socioeconomic grievances. But to me, I think the religiosity is real and substantive. So religious extremism is an acute form of fundamentalism, and there's been a big literature on the fundamentalism phenomenon. I won't go into details. But essentially, fundamentalism is a sense of embattled religiosity. Fundamentalism is religion under threat. So I understand religious extremism, including Salafist extremism, as a fundamentalist belief system that legitimizes structural violence against relevant outgroups. And in the Southeast Asian context, Salafist extremism is a fundamentalist belief system that legitimizes structural violence, not just physical violence, but structural violence against non-Muslims, and also those Muslims who are seen as apostates. And structural violence, just to quickly illustrate, it's more than just hostile physical action. It includes verbal attacks, discrimination. Johan Galtung many years ago talked about violence that works on the body as well as violence that works on the soul, right? So Galtung's point was violence can be built into the structure, right? So the point is, extremism does not always need to manifest in physical harm. It can be more structural and indirect. So this whole idea of structural violence and physical harm implicit in it is well captured in actually the US Anti-Defamation League's Pyramid of Hate, right? So this might be familiar to a number of you. So the first three, the first three levels from the bottom, biased attitudes, acts of bias and discrimination, you can consider that to be not violent extremism, right? Whereas when you go to the last two, bias-motivated violence and genocide, that is the violent extremism. So the point is, there is from a social psychological perspective, there is a potential for progression from not violent structural violence to violent physical violence, right? And in fact, there have been many scholars that talk about this. This scholar from Germany, the German Egyptian scholar, political scientist Hamid Abdul Samad has talked about this before. For example, about the perils of linguistic dehumanization. He says that to utter a word like kafir is to embark on the first step towards violence, right? Treating those with different beliefs or ideas like animals and paving the roads to acts of terrorism, murder. And I think this is an important point. Preachers may not openly endorse violence, but their social views and treatment of others legitimize strengthening the spiritual framework behind Islamist terrorism. So his point actually makes a very strong point. No one who lets Salafist extremists preach anti-democratic, anti-human sermons of hate in public should be surprised when sooner or later their messages lead to violence, right? We certainly see this sort of thing in Southeast Asia, right? This is a well-known extremist leader in Southeast Asia, Abu Bakr Bashir. He was leader of the spiritual leader of the Jamaat Islamiyah network in Southeast Asia. Just to give you an example, I mean, this is in essence dangerous speech in the soft mode, and this is when Bashir was speaking in public, right? So just taking a look at this, you can sort of see that it's not a very friendly public sermon, right? But you can say it's intolerant, but here there is no direct incitement to violence, right? But this is Bashir in public, right? But in fact, a journalist once asked him, why are your sermons so unfriendly? And his comment was, I'm only a craftsman selling knives. I'm not responsible for how those knives are used. Which to me, when I read that many years ago, I thought it was interesting comment to make. But Bashir in private, right? And this is reported by an Australian journalist who managed to get to be part of a relatively close meeting. In private, Bashir was more open about, what he would like his followers to do to non-Muslims. This particular case, tourists in Bali, right? He called upon young Javanese youth to beat them up. So that's direct incitement to violence, right? He called Muslims in Indonesia reject the laws of the nation's parliament, right? And so it's the same. It's essentially, this is what I mean. The Salafist extremist can toggle. He can toggle between not violent and violent speech, depending on his assessment of the evolving context. A Salafist extremist is an extremist, right? Right. So there's another example. Very quickly, this gentleman was actually barred from entering Singapore last year. He is an Indonesian preacher, very charismatic, big social media presence. His messages seem to be witty, right? I mean, he's got away with words, right? And also, it's to be fair, there's never been any evidence that he actually supports, for example, groups like Islamic State. So you can't really technically call him a Salafist extremist per se. But if you look at his postings, you can see dangerous speech in both the soft mode and the hard mode. For example, he has referred to non-Muslims as kafirs, right? And said all those other things about the non-Muslims, right? As you can see, it's claimed that suicide bombings are legitimate, right? And the thing is, although Abdul Samad Batubara himself may not have directly said very violent things, he may have promoted intolerant rhetoric online, but his followers are the people who actually went a step further and called for Singapore to be bombed and destroyed. One of his followers posted stuff like, we need to send Islamic defender troops to attack Singapore, like 911 in New York. Another follower said that just one missile, Singapore will be finished. And the thing is, Abdul Samad, his online sermons also helped radicalize a young Singaporean who believed that if he fought for ISIS as a suicide bomber, he would die as a martyr. So Abdul Samad technically may not really be a Salafist extremist, right? Because he's not, can't see that any evidence that he supports Islamic State, but he certainly indirectly nurtured Salafist extremism, right? And the thing is, he has also claimed that Singapore is Malay land, right? And this goes to the point about structural violence, right? So his sermons tend to give the impression that, non-Muslim Singaporeans, you're in a Malay archipelago, a Muslim archipelago, right? So, you should, you should know your place, so to speak. And this is extreme in the sense that it represents a clear deviation from the internationally recognized legal constitutional status of multiracial, multi-religious Singapore as a sovereign, independent, secular country, right? So the wider point is there are Salafist extremists online in Southeast Asia for sure, but there are other types of fundamentalist extremists associated with Southeast Asian Islam like Abdul Samad, who are extremists, right? And they're active on the online space too, right? So at least in Southeast Asia, we are learning not to over-focus on just those Salafist extremists who are linked directly to Al-Qaeda or IS. There are other types of fundamentalist extremists as well, right? So coming to the end, right? So how does the Salafist ideology that sustains and regenerates these threat groups in Southeast Asia get disseminated? What I talk about the 3 Ps: persons, places, and platforms, right? So I call this the persons, places, and platforms represent the ideological ecosystem, right? That actually goes beyond social media, right? So in Southeast Asia, the Salafist ecosystem, which comprises, as I said, the 3 Ps, refer to persons. These persons are the guys who directly influence and help radicalize individuals. person, first P. Second P is platform. And platform can be publications by well-known extremists, print publications, audio, visual media, carrying extremist content that radicalizing individuals can immerse themselves in. This can include social media, doesn't have to be social media, right? But there are various platforms. And places, these are extremist spaces, right? Where individuals can gather with extremists and get radicalized, whether they are private homes, extremist religious institutions, training camps, private sports clubs, whatever. So this is the ecosystem. I summarize it as 3 Ps: persons, platforms, and places. And give you an example in the book which I wrote last year. I talked about a few guys. One was this gentleman, Abu Hamdi, not his real name, right? So how do you apply the 3 Ps or the persons, places, and platforms framework to him? How was he radicalized through that Salafist ecosystem? The person that essentially had a big influence on Abu Hamdi as a 19-year-old was Muhammad Jamal Khalifa, who was Al-Qaeda leader, Osama bin Laden's brother-in-law, actually, and who was chief of the International Islamic Relief Organization, who had set up and funded. It was a charity, charity which was linked to Al-Qaeda. In the late 1980s, Khalifa set up this Darul Imam Shafi boarding school in Marawi City in southern Philippines in 1989. And Khalifa was a significant person that helped to radicalize Abu Hamdi. Darul Imam Shafi as a boarding school was a significant place in Abu Hamdi's radicalization as well. In fact, many Darul Imam Shafi graduates later joined Abu Sayyaf group and later even the Moral Islamic Liberation Front in the earlier stage before MILF began to become relatively more moderate, right? So notable Darul Imam Shafi alumni included the Abu Sayyaf group leaders like Gaddafi Jalani and Yasir Igasan. And in terms of platforms, Abu Hamdi, I interviewed him many years ago. He was telling me that within Darul Imam Shafi, publications by people like Ibn Taymiyyah, right, who's a well-known classical Islamic scholar who tends to be, his more extreme views tend to be influential in jihadi circles, right, was always circulated within Darul Imam Shafi. And other core Salafist ideologues such as Maududi, Said Qutb, Al-Wahhab himself. Another person I actually got to know was the Malaysian Jamaah Islamiyah treasurer, Wan Min Wan Mat, who's now reformed and working with the Malaysian government. The person that influenced Wan Min Wan Mat very significantly was Bashir himself and the co-founder of Jamaah Islamiyah, Abdullah Sungkar. So Wan Min Wan Mat, who was a lecturer in a Malaysian university, technical university in the southern part of the country, got to know them. A very significant place where Wan Min Wan Wat was radicalized was this Pesantren or religious boarding school called Manul Hakim. There are also private homes that are places where Wan Min Wan Wat used to attend. University Technology Malaysia, UTM in Johor. Not the university as a whole, but certain spaces in the university, right? And platforms, publications by Abdullah Azam, Ibn Taymiyyah again, Wahab Qutb, the usual people that tend to figure on jihadist reading lists, right? So again, persons, places, platforms. So these comprise the ideological ecosystem in which people like Wan Min Wan Mat and Abu Hamdi were immersed in and got radicalized. So finally, how can we counter Salafist extremism in Southeast Asia? I talk about the so-called 4M way, right? How we can respond, right? So the first M, right, is message content, right? So I talk about the need for proactive alternative narratives, much better than reactive counter narratives. For example, what I mean is, if the Salafist extremists say that the government is against you, a counter narrative would be, no, the government is not against you, and I'll give you an example. Rather than, like reacting all the time, should provide an alternative narrative. For example, actually, tolerant Southeast Asian Islam is fully compatible with modernity, or Southeast Asian Islamic cultures are just as authentic as Islamic culture in the Middle East, right? So it's more proactive rather than reactive message content. Apart from message content, the second M is message framing. How do you put the message across? And this is where some communications scholars talk about the message being sticky, right? It's got to be memorable, right? Snackable content, the use of satire and humor. The third M, message dissemination. How you have your message content, right? You got your alternative narrative. You have your humorous message. But how do you disseminate the message? And this is where precision, I argue, precision in the use of platforms for particular audiences would be actually worth thinking about, right? So in Southeast Asia, when I did the research, it was discussed that Twitter may be good for government and media, but Instagram for youth, right? That kind of thing, message dissemination. And finally, the fourth M, I would say probably the most important. You may have an excellent message, right? Your content may be great. You may have a good skill in framing your message, which can be very sticky, right? You may be spot on in terms of your platform for disseminating the message. But if the audience is not in the mood to listen to you, you got a problem, right? And this is where ultimately good governance to address the wider political, socio-economic grievances are important, because good governance, which addresses very effectively the underlying grievances that give rise to discontent, would impact the receptivity of the target audience to your positive messaging. So right now, for example, Southern Philippines, although very positive steps have been taken towards Bangsamoro, self-determination, with the creation of the Bangsamoro Autonomous Region, the Muslim Mindanao, which is a very powerful thing, right? The slow pace of Marawi reconstruction, relatively speaking, most analysts would say isn't that good a thing, because you do need to bring the displaced persons back to Marawi city, otherwise sort out the job situation, because otherwise there will be discontent which can fuel recruitment to extremist groups. Yeah. So ultimately, yeah. So that's what I wanted to bring across to all of you. Yeah. Thanks very much. Back to you, Professor Blackwell.
Thank you very much, Professor Ramakrishna. We do have some questions, and I did promise to let you go. I realize it's late there. The first question is, can you talk about local resistance to these groups? And what is the landscape and effectiveness of local militias in hotspots where these groups are most active?
Okay, so in places like it's a varied picture. Let's take Indonesia, for example. Civil society, I would say, is playing a very big role now, because right now the Indonesian government, especially through the BNPT, which is the National Counterterrorism Agency, has engaged in a very big way with civil society to sort of address the underlying conditions that give rise to this Salafist extremism. So that kind of resistance in the non-kinetic sense is actually very important. Of course, if you look at Indonesia, the work of the police, in particular, the Densus 88, the Detachment 88, Police Counterterrorism Force, that is still very important. But ultimately, you need both kinds of resistance, right? You need the kinetic resistance, which is represented by Densus 88, and the non-kinetic resistance, which is very important, which is all the other things I mentioned as well. In the Southern Philippines, as I mentioned, the Bangsamoro Autonomous Region of Muslim Mindanao, BARM, that has been a very powerful step in terms of creating a autonomous governance structure, which is really been taken to by very well by most of the Moro Southern Philippine Muslim population, and this has helped to reduce support for the likes of, for example, the Abu Sayyaf group, Bangsamoro Islamic Freedom Fighters, and in fact, if you look at a situation past couple of years, past two or 3 years, certainly since the Marawi battle in May to October 2017, past 2 years, 3 years, there have been a spike in the number of surrenders by the Salafist militants belonging to groups like Abu Sayyaf Group, Bangsamoro Islamic Freedom Fighters, and this is so that's again, it's a combination of resistance kinetically, right, Armed Forces Philippines operations, but also the non-kinetic side as well, good governance, right? A similar thing in Singapore, Malaysia. It's not that kinetic actually. A lot of the work is essentially on the counter narrative or alternative narrative space, particularly in Singapore and Malaysia. Yeah. Yep.
Thank you. The next question is, what kind of community support or lack thereof exists for extremist Salafists in the cultural context?
What kind of, sorry, what?
Kind of community support or lack of support exists for extremist Salafists in the cultural context?
That's a good question. If you look, for example, at Indonesia, a general point that can be observed is that the regions in, for example, Central Java, West Java, East Java, where the historical Darul Islam separatist movement used to operate, and also in South Sulawesi, right? These regions where there's been a historical separatist movement tend to be also where you find pockets of community support for some of the Salafist extremist groups. A good example in recent times would be in Poso, which is a city in Sulawesi, right? Poso has been a kind of community site. I wouldn't say base, but an area where historically there has been extremist Salafist support. And in recent years, the MIT, the East Indonesian Mujahideen, they've always operated in very small numbers, but they've always been resilient. They've been active in that part of Indonesia, and partly because of pockets of support in Poso, in Sulawesi, right? In fact, it's only very recently that joint Indonesian military and police operations have essentially defeated MIT, the East Indonesian Mujahideen Indonesia Timur, MIT, East Indonesian Mujahideen in Poso and Central Sulawesi. And that's partly because Poso has historically been, a culture which has had a history of separatism and extremism among pockets within that place. Yeah. But I would say that the situation, even in Poso, is definitely improving because, as I mentioned recently, the MIT group has been all but decimated. There were very few militants left there anyway. Yep.
You mentioned Indonesia. There's a question here about, can you talk about the 2018 anti-terrorism bill or law in Indonesia and its effect on countering terrorist groups?
The 2018 anti-terrorism legislation essentially came about as a response to the rather shocking incidents of what some people have called, family terrorism, where, for example, essentially in Surabaya, Eastern Indonesia, in May 2018, there were entire families, radicalized families that were involved in attacks on churches as well as a police station. And this essentially involved entire families, and this essentially created a lot of understandably created a lot of consternation amongst Indonesian counterterrorism authorities, and this helped to bring about the political will to sort of like enhance the capacity of the law enforcement to sort of deal more strongly with some of these groups in terms of the number of the days you can, for example, detain some of these guys for questioning and that kind of thing, as well as definition of who is a supporter, what you can do to supporters and that kind of thing. So essentially, it empowered the Indonesian authorities to take stronger action to sort of deal with the spread of these guys who were involved in the incidents in May 2018 in Surabaya. They belong to Jamaah Ansur Daulah, JAD, which is a very pro-ISIS, very Salafabis extremist. So that is something which has been, to me, a positive development in Indonesia since then.
Okay, Professor, the last question, and then we'll let you go to your other activities. There's a lot of, I liked your 3 Ps and the 4 Ms as a way of kind of framing the discussion. And, we've spoken a lot about counter narratives and countering radicalization. What, in your view, what kinds of interventions are the most effective? And I realize we're talking about different contexts and different areas, but what kinds of interventions have you seen be the most successful?
Yeah, it's a good practical question. A few years ago, RSIS co-organized a major conference in Manila with the Philippine Center for Islam and Democracy, PCID, and we were the 2 main organizations. We had a lot of support from other agencies as well, international agencies as well. But this conference was very useful. We had about 400 people, and we got a bunch of participants from across government, from social media companies, civil society, religious leaders from the not just Philippines, but the Southeast Asian region. And in terms of the countering the extremist narrative, right? I think there are a couple of things which I recall, which I think are still relevant today. Number one, at some point, you really do need to engage the religious leaders, the Muslim Islamic scholars, if you like. How you engage them, well, that really depends on your national context. You need to engage the religious leaders. Why? Because they are the ones, not the government, the religious scholars, the independent religious scholars, the independent moderate religious scholars. They are the ones who know the hadiths and the Quran the best, right? And they have the locus standi and the credibility to sort of tell the audience, right? Look, this is what these guys say about jihad. Oh, that's wrong, right? I mean, they can say it. So you need to have the religious leaders to establish the theological baseline as to where religious thought becomes extreme. They can do it. So you have to have religious leaders. Number 2, you also need to expand the number of, the kinds of people involved to include women and youth, right? The role of women, and I think it's not just applies just to Southeast Asia. I mean, the role of women, you can see it's very important across the world. Like, well, certainly in Southeast Asia, we have found that, if the woman, say the mom, or the spouse, right? If the mother or the wife, right, is not radicalized, that is a powerful protective factor against radicalization within the family unit, right? But if it's the other way around, the mom or the spouse is also radicalized, well, that's a risk factor, and we saw that in the case of the Surabaya bombings. Well, not just the Surabaya bombings, which were linked to the Jamaah Ansarud Daulah, but also even in southern Philippines, where we've seen families implicated in terrorist incidents as well. So, and young people, right? Young people understand other young people. So in terms of the 4 M's, right? In terms of message content, dissemination, right? Young people have good ideas which can be harnessed in designing alternative narratives, which could be targeted at other young people. So you have religious scholars, we need women, we need young people. Yep. And the final thing which came out from that particular conference, which I think is still relevant, is you need to have, well, it sounds like a cliche, but well, it's got to be a whole society approach. You need social media companies involved. You need the civil society people involved. You need the community leaders, the grassroots leaders involved. And it's got to be orchestrated. It's got to be coordinated. So the role of the government or relevant agency would be to play that coordinating role in order to devise effective. You need a coordinating role, and you need to be inclusive, right? And you need the coordination to ensure that your alternative narratives actually have impact, right? And you got to design the composition of the stakeholders who are going to be involved in line with that particular national context. And I think context matters as well. I think that's very important. Yeah.
Professor, if you will, and you can answer very briefly, I've got one final question, which I think is a really good one and worth discussing. A number of foreign fighters from South Asia joined ISIS and Al Qaeda in conflict zones. A number have now been repatriated. What's the impact of those that have been repatriated in terms of radicalization and Salafism?
In Southeast Asia, we had about, by some estimates, almost 1,000 individuals that went to the Middle East at the height of the so-called ISIS Caliphate. Mainly Indonesians, a number of Malaysians, very small number of Singaporeans. A number of them were repatriated. The biggest challenge has been because it's not just fighters that came back; they came back with their families, right? So a big challenge is now reintegration, rehabilitation, and reintegration, and this is why. Well, certainly Indonesia and Malaysia, they are paying a lot of attention to this. They don't see this that much in Singapore because Singapore is small and we didn't have that many people going there anyway. But in Indonesia, particularly Indonesia, the big challenge now is reintegration, rehabilitation. Families, it's not just fighters, it's families. So, and this is still ongoing, and this has been the biggest challenge. But positive thing I can say is I think the Indonesians understand this, and that is a national effort which involves not just government agencies, but also civil society has stepped up. So that's a very useful space to watch.
Thank you very much. Professor, we're most grateful for your time, especially given the time zone challenges. So I would like to thank you on behalf of all of us here in GTAC. Look forward to maintaining the contact and discussions. I'd like to thank everybody for listening in, and stay tuned for our next event. So thank you, everybody, and enjoy the rest of your Wednesday.
Thank you very much, Ambassador, and see all of you. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Have a good day.